Hello everyone and welcome back. This is Ryan Adams. We're going to start working on part 2 of building out our lab environment for FCIs and availability groups. Last time we took care of all of our settings in Hyper-V, building out all of our VMs, making sure the settings and configuration was right, installing the OS, making sure that all those pieces were configured, and most importantly, where we spent a good chunk of time was making sure that we had our network done correctly. We had our NIC cards put in the VMs, that we have all of the NICs in the VM labeled to what their function is. Looking here at node 1 is an example. If we go in and just take a look at our network here real quick, you'll notice that what I've done is I have labeled all of the NIC cards in here, right? So net 1 private, network 1 public, and the network 3 is for my availability group. You will see why I named these once we create the cluster, that it just makes things easier to find and a little bit more clear when troubleshooting comes around if you label them that way. So now that we have everything done, right, we've installed failover cluster service on all 3 nodes. We took care of our domain controller, making sure that we had routing remote access services so we could get all these guys routed out to the internet. So all those pieces are done. Now let's work on actually building out the cluster. So the first thing we're going to do is I've opened up failover cluster manager here, and we're going to come over here to the far right hand side, and we're going to click validate configuration. So we'll click validate here and we'll run through the validation wizard. The first thing it asks is what servers are going to be members of this cluster. It needs to know that to validate them. So we'll type in node 1, node 2, and node 3. You'll notice that when it resolves them, it does resolve them using the fully qualified domain name. That's not what I typed in, but it does use the FQDN. Typically speaking, I always suggest to use a fully qualified domain name. So we'll do next here, and we are going to choose the run all tests option. If you do have problems and issues and you just want to troubleshoot that one issue, then this is handy to just run that individual test to get that resolved. Once you've got it resolved though, you should go back and do the run all tests because that's the only way that the report actually gets updated. So we'll do run all tests here. It's automatically figured everything out from the input that I've given it, which was just the node 1, 2, and 3. That's really all it needed to know. And it's going to go through and run all of these various validation tests. And it's got a bunch of tests that it runs here. Everything from, do I have the right software updates? Do I have the right network paths? Can I talk to each node from every one of those network paths? So that's why we spent a lot of time making sure that our network was set up and configured correctly. We wanted to make sure that when we got to this piece that we weren't going to run into any type of problems or issues here. Now, validation does take a little bit of time here in our demo environment. It really shouldn't take that long. But the funny thing is it actually takes longer to validate it than it does to create it. So that is something that is important that we want to make sure that we do, is that we go through this validation thing. Anytime you make a change to a cluster in production, you should always run validation just to make sure that everything is the way that we want it and it's all going to be good to go. So it's done now, and we're presented with this screen. You'll notice, and we'll do this here in a minute, that there is a checkbox right here at the bottom for create the cluster now. So we will do that. We're going to check that box off. We'll click finish, and that'll start the wizard to actually create the cluster. But what I really want to do before that is I want to view the report. I want to make sure that everything's okay, especially since I see this box up here. This tells me that it had a couple of warnings inside of validation, so I want to make sure that those are okay. So let's click the view report button and see what we get. Click allow blocked content just so we can see all of the icons here. So I can see that the inventory came back with success, network came back with success, storage was not applicable, and that's good, and we're using availability groups here right now, so there is no shared storage I presented at this point. So it realized that that was the case and said that is not applicable, but I did get a warning here on system config. Let's go see what that is. Yep, of course, it's validate software update levels. Super common one. We'll dig into that and see what it is. It's telling me that on node 2 that I am missing a update for Windows Defender. And it's also telling me that I'm missing that on node 3. So I must have had an update for Windows Defender on node 1 that's still missing on node 2 and node 3. It's just a warning, doesn't prevent me from creating the cluster. And I know for me in my demo environment, especially just being Windows Defender, which will get updated, I'm not too concerned about that right now. So no problem there. Since we have no issues to be concerned about, we'll check the box here. We're going to click Finish. And this immediately starts the new, wizard for creating a cluster, which would be the same as if I had clicked this Create Cluster right here. Exact same wizard that it would kick off. I note that all this stuff can be done through PowerShell. I encourage you to do that, especially in a demo environment. I know for me, I'm showing you the GUI version here, but I do have all this stuff built in PowerShell because if I need to, break it and redo it, it's a whole lot easier to just kick off a script than it is to walk through all this GUI stuff. So I'll click Next here, and it's asking for the name of the cluster. For us, we're just going to call it Cluster 1, right? It's just a demo environment and nothing super fancy. But for that cluster network name that it creates, remember we're creating an object in Active Directory, we're creating this in DNS, so we need to have some IP addresses assigned here. The IPs that I want to assign it here are going to be on my public network. So you can view this back in the blog post, of course, but for me, my handy cheat sheet here is I want one in the public networks, and I have two of those. Right? I have the public network for my first data center and a public network for my second data center, which is represented here, right? Because node 1 and node 2 are in my first data center, node 3 is in my other. So the IPs I'm going to use here, I'm going to come out of the cluster column. I'm going to use a 10.0.0.10 and a 172.16.0.10. So first network here, 10.0.0.10. I'm not using this one for that. That's a private network. We've got AG networks in here. So the other public we're going to find is my 172.16. And then we'll uncheck all of the other ones. We're not using those for the cluster. So let's click Next here. It's going to go validate and check all of that out. I'm going to leave this checkbox here, add all eligible storage to the cluster. I could easily uncheck it here because there is none. So without any shared storage, there's actually nothing for it to add to the cluster to be able to do that anyway. So I could have as easily just unchecked it, but it doesn't hurt to check it. It'll just realize, oh, hey, there's no storage here. No need to worry about that. Now this will happen pretty quick. This actually happens quicker than validation itself does. So there we already have it. It's already done. You can click the view report here if you want to. Most of this, unless there was some type of issue, is not near as informative as the validation, right? It's just showing you all that. It's nowhere near the in-depth that we would get out of cluster validation. But I didn't have any issues, so I can just click Finish. There we go. Now my cluster is built. Now, for our demo here, there are a couple of different things that we're going to want to make sure we get clarified and fixed. Now, right off the bat, one thing you're going to notice here is I already have a warning, which is kind of interesting because I just created this cluster brand new and cluster validation came back clean. Why do I have a warning here? There actually is we'll click on this, and this is going to be exactly expected. If I zoom on the error message, it says there's no matching network interface found for this cluster IP address. If I keep reading over here, it says if your cluster nodes span different subnets, right, this may, other than the line, be normal. And it is. For us, it's normal. Here's what it's complaining about. When I come down here and I look at the cluster core resources, because this is a multi-subnet cluster, this IP address is offline. That is by design. If I fail this over to node 3, this IP will actually come online and the 10.0.0.10 will go offline. So this is by design because we are in a multi-subnet environment. So that's the only reason we have that warning. So that is perfectly safe to ignore. That is all part of the plan. The other thing we'll notice here too, that it's not necessarily part of the plan, is there is no witness. So if I had had shared disks, it would have chosen one, and note to self, it will choose it at random of what it's going to use for the witness disk. I didn't have any, but I do want a witness. In fact, I'm going to use a file share witness. We're going to come back. We're going to configure that in a minute, but I want to take a look at the network piece first before we do that. We'll just check a couple of other things. Roles, of course, is blank, perfectly what I would expect. And the nodes, I should see all 3 nodes here, and I do. And they all look good. Their status is up. They all look green. They're all assigned a vote. They all currently have a vote. So all of that is exactly what I would expect out of this brand new cluster. No point looking at storage. We don't have any shared storage, at least not at this point, so there's no need to mess with that. Networks, however, there are some changes we probably want to make here. But let's take a look at what these networks actually are first. So looking here, I can see I've got public IDs and private and AGs and all kinds of good stuff in here. So let's start off by looking at this very first one. Now you'll notice that it's pretty apparent what they are. And the reason it's apparent is because this is the name I gave those NIC cards in Node 1 and Node 2. This is why I name all of my NIC cards, and I encourage you to do that here in your demo environment and to do that in production as well. So it's very clear to me right up front without any guesswork that those are indeed my public addresses for the first network in my first data center. Let's go check a couple of things. As far as these pieces down here, I'm fine, since this is the public, to allow cluster and client connections. That is actually perfectly fine for this. You may think, well, if I have a dedicated private network, then I probably would want to select do not allow cluster here because I already have cluster on a different network. But Windows clustering is smart enough to know that if you have another network that is dedicated to just cluster traffic, that it's always going to use that one first. But it will also use this one as a backup. If I select do not allow cluster network, then that removes this from being a backup. So even though I'm allowing cluster and client here, and I'm really only wanting this for clients, it will provide this as a backup for cluster communication if my other cluster network goes down. So let's label this, because cluster network 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in here doesn't really look great. All right, this is something that I would want to make this look a little bit better. So let's call this like data center 1, network 1, we'll call it net 1, and this is public. Save some time, I'm going to kind of copy that out here. And we'll go ahead and click OK here. So that has a better label on it, a little bit easier to figure out what's going on. This is pretty much the same, but I can see that the NIC cards in here are both my Node 1 and Node 2, same data center, but this is the private network connection. So we're going to go in, take a look at that. We're going to rename it, and we're going to rename that data center 1, but this is going to be network 2, and this is going to be private for my label. And then what I'm going to do is make some changes here. This is dedicated to my private network. So this is the choice I want to make is the choice I want to make here is to uncheck allowing clients. That way it will only allow cluster communication and nothing else. So we'll uncheck that box. Clients can't talk here, but cluster network communication is fine. So I'm going to click OK here. It says the network's no longer available for clients to connect. That's right, I don't want clients to connect here. This is only for cluster communication. Now, here's what's interesting. The change that we just made in this cluster use column, it didn't actually take effect. So whenever I make 2 changes to this, and I did make 2 changes because I renamed it, which that did work, and I made this change, it doesn't take effect. What you really need to do is make a change and click apply in between. So now I'm going to re-uncheck this. Now I'll click OK, click OK. Now it takes. Now I can see that it changed it to cluster only. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. Continuing on, this is for AG traffic. So again, this one's going to be a little bit different. This is still in data center 1 because I can see I have node 1 and node 2 here. So let's go in and make some changes. Let's rename it. Okay, DC1. Let's call this network 3 because it is a totally different separate network here. Let's call it AG. Now, because this is dedicated to my availability group traffic, I don't want this to be used at all. So first of all, I'm going to click apply because I already made a name change. That way that piece will take effect. And then I'm going to change the radio to do not allow cluster communication on this network. OK there. Now we'll notice that it says none, which is great because I don't want the cluster to use this. This is going to be dedicated for my availability group traffic. Continuing on, we'll keep renaming these. So now we're into the node 3. So now this is a different data center that we're looking at. This is the public side. So that is going to give this guy data center 2. He's going to be network 1 on that data center, and it is still public. So data center 2, network 1, public. And again, we're going to leave both boxes, this first radio button in the box, checked here as well. And this guy here, I can see this is using the private NIC card for node 3. So let's go paste that in. This is going to be data center 2. This will be network 2. And this is going to be private. Click apply for that change. I'm going to uncheck the box for allowing clients if this is a private network. Apply that change as well. I can see that looks exactly how I want it to look. And then here is this guy. So we're going to call him data center 2. He is network 3 over there. He's for my AG traffic. Apply for the name change. Apply for the radio and change the radio button here. Apply. OK and OK. And now everything looks the way that I want it to. Client and cluster for my public connections right here. I'll zoom in, right? So network 1. So public is both cluster and client. These are my two publics. I'm going to go take a look at my privates. So that's just cluster only on my two private networks. And then for my AG, we have that set for none. So now all of my networks are labeled the way I want them, and they're configured the way that I want them for the type of traffic that I need. So that looks good. That's great. The only thing left to really fix here is I could really use a file share witness here. In our demo environment, the best candidate for this is going to be to stick it on our domain controller. Again, just a demo environment, never do this in public, but that's what we're building this for. So what I really need to do is go over to the domain controller, and we need to just create a file share on here that we can use for that witness. So I'm just going to go down here. We're just going to create a new folder right under the root of C, and I'm just going to call this FSW for file share witness. All right, good. So we've got that as FSW. Let's go into the properties. Let's share this guy out. So I'm going to sharing. I'm going to go to advanced sharing. We're going to share this folder. FSW is a perfectly fine share name for me, but we need to look at the permissions situation here. So everyone gets read by default out of the box here, but I need to give permissions for the cluster to use it. So what we need to do when I click add is the cluster account that it's going to authenticate with is actually going to be using the computer object of what represents the cluster. That is actually going to be something we can find in Active Directory, is going to be the name of our cluster. When we do that, and actually let's just take a look at it because I think I have, here we go, Active Directory using computers open. When we take a look at this, when we created the cluster, it has created a computer object here in Active Directory called cluster1. That's our security context. That's what we want to use here. Now, in order to do that, I do need to change object types here. And we need to put a check mark in computer, so we'll also include computer objects. Down here, we're going to go type that computer name in. So it is cluster 1. For computer objects, we put a $ after it. We'll click check names, and it filled it out. So we're good there. And we'll just go ahead and give it full control. Now that is on the share permissions and has created the share. I am on an NTFS volume though, which means that it is the least or the most restrictive is what's going to count here. So I need to go ahead and give some permissions here on the NTFS side as well. So click the security tab, edit. We're going to add, again, object type. We need to check off computers. And I'm going to type in cluster 1 $ here. Hit check names, it finds it. Click OK, full control. Modify is actually perfectly fine here, so we can just do modify. We'll do apply here, do OK, and then we'll click close. So that gives us our file share. Let's go back over here to the cluster and see what we can do about making that change. So I'm going to go to configure cluster quorum settings over here. So this is under more actions, configure cluster quorum settings. Next, to begin our wizard, I'm going to take a look at advanced, just because I like to see everything. So yep, all nodes get a vote. That's perfectly fine for me on Quorum, but I want to use configure a file share. Now you could easily use a cloud witness here as well, which would be perfectly valid for this and easy to do as well. But if you want to keep it self-contained in your VMs and you're trying to represent this particular option of using a file share witness, you can certainly do that. Now, of course, we could use a disk witness too. Right now, I don't have any shared storage. We'll cover that later in the FCI module of building all this stuff out for your demo environment, where you could add a disk witness here and use that as well. So we'll do a file share witness. Whack DC1 FSW is the path. Assuming, and we'll do next here, assuming I did it all correctly. We'll click finish here and got the permissions correct, and there we go. So now I can see that I do have my file share witness sitting up here, and we'll also see it down here at the bottom as well. Here's my file share witness. He is online and good to go. So that concludes part 2 of building out our lab environment and this section on building out the actual Windows cluster piece itself. This gives us a great platform for building the rest of the pieces that we need here in our demo environment. The next piece we'll talk about is building out the availability group, and then we'll get into doing a failover cluster instance and some shared storage stuff in Module 4. So thanks for sticking with me and listening through this, and we will catch you in the next section.